Welcome back, everyone. Lovely to see you. I hope you enjoyed lunch. Curry was good. The vibe in the vaults was brilliant. And listen, let's jump into the afternoon session. And what a fantastic...
Sorry, I missed the curry.
You missed the curry?
I missed the curry.
What did you have?
My favourite food is curry cooked by white men. Honestly. Generally, I love it. Jamie Oliver's curry. Carry on, sorry.
This is the place for you. Someone save some curry for Sathnam for later on. Listen, fantastic to welcome to the house, Sathnam Sanghera. You know his work, I'm sure you do. He's one of the most perceptive, sharpest, subtlest, and funniest observers of this place, not RSA, the UK, Britain, and its place in the world, and what it's done to the world. He is now memoirist, journalist, novelist, and historian through his various books. And one of those books, Empireland, known, I imagine, to many, if not everyone in the room. Book of the Year, National Book Awards 2021, and now followed up by his brilliant companion work, Empireworld. I imagine we'll get onto both of those today, Sathnam, one time or another. The first tracing the impact of empire on British identity, the latest book doing the same thing on the global stage and demonstrating all of those skills that I mentioned at the very outset. Sathnam, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
To the RSA. Fantastic to have you here.
I learnt an important lesson, which is that the RSA is not the Royal Academy today.
It's not.
As I went there. But you were connected at one point.
So we were the origin of the Royal Academy. So back in the 1760s, one of the first things we did is host the first ever young person's art exhibition in this room, from which a splinter group went off and created the Royal Academy.
And the Royal Academy, I think, at the moment has singularly the most interesting exhibition I've ever seen on colonialism and slavery. I recommend it if you guys haven't seen it. It's incredible. It's the kind of exhibition that lots of us wanted, and we were told there's not enough material, no one's going to come, and actually it's a blockbuster. It's got rave reviews, 5 stars, even I think in The Spectator. And so this history is not just really important, it's also really interesting. I think it's the most interesting conversation in the world at the moment.
Yeah.
Colonialism.
Well, we're going to have that conversation, I hope.
I keep stopping you, I'm sorry.
Not at all. It's maybe. This is the conversation in the room, by the way, so we can go to the room very early on for thoughts and questions for Sathnam. I want to kick us off, though, just to warm us up. I think this is a quote from you. Empireland is about putting Britain on the therapist's couch. Now, I put it to you, Sathnam. Was that your aim when you kicked off? Was that the therapist?
Well, it's an act of therapy for me, but I think therapy is a good analogy because I often get accused of being divisive. Why talk about all this dark stuff? You know, isn't it divisive? Shouldn't we just move on? Don't you hate Britain that you want to talk about slavery and genocide? And it's like, I'm in therapy. It doesn't mean I hate my mother. You know, it's actually, it can be an act of love that you've gone into therapy. You want a better relationship with your family. And yeah, I think it's a very apt way to look at it. I think as a country, we haven't gone through a process of truth and reconciliation with the fact that we were behind the biggest empire in human history. It kind of ended, and we never really thought about it again. And it's created all sorts of problems.
Yeah. And the act of writing these 2 fantastic books, what's it done for you? Tell me how it affected you personally, your thoughts, your perceptions on the country that you call home. Yeah,
I guess, again, it's not something that people often ask me, you know, didn't it make you hate Britain? It has the opposite effect, because actually it makes me locate myself in Britain more profoundly. I now know that we are a multicultural country because we had a multicultural empire. Yeah. I now know that brown people and black people were hugely involved in World War I and World War II, something I was never taught at school, you know. I now know that the money from India and from slavery helped build this country. And that places me in a more profound way. And then, of course, I'm a Sikh. And, the Sikh identity, which was largely created and shaped by the British, the idea that we're a martial race, as you can see, looking at me, it's obviously true. But that idea, and also Sikh demographics, so many people converted to Sikhism because the British fetishized us in the late 19th century. The British Empire even explains our numbers. So for me, this history is absolutely intrinsic to me. I can't separate it from my own life story. Or even the story of the Royal Society.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I mean,
yeah.
There's a plaque downstairs which shows how at various times the Royal Society gave awards for people making innovations in slavery, but other times made awards for reducing the burden on the enslaved. So that's a deeply complicated history, right?
It is. I think any institution our age inevitably has to confront that.
Yeah.
There's no avoiding it. We're steeped in that. But when you're talking about these issues, though, and you do so, I should say, in a beautiful and subtle way, in a non-confrontational way, which I think is really important. You talk about this is not a question of totting up the assets and liabilities. That kind of national balance sheet approach is the wrong way to think about this.
Yeah, well, it's a good question coming from you, an economist.
Thank you.
But yeah, I mean, it's an absurd way to look at the history, just because how do you balance miles of railway against millions of lives lost in a famine? It's an absurd equation. But then, I mean, what I've realized in Empireworld is that not only the legacy is complex, but they're contradictory. You've got empire, resulted in quite a lot of democracy in various parts of the world through complicated kind of processes. It also resulted in massive geopolitical chaos in Burma, Nigeria, Kashmir, Pakistan, Palestine. Empire resulted in massive environmental destruction around the world. It also led to the birth of modern environmentalism. Empire was involved in slavery massively. 3 million Africans transported across the Atlantic. Equally, it was involved in anti-slavery and went around the world abolishing it. So two things can be true at the same time. This is something social media and British politics cannot handle, And actually, I think people can't handle it, but it is something that books can explain. And I really do think that the idea that opposite things can be true at the same time is a secret to coping with a whole bunch of really difficult things in the world. A lot of conflicts, Israel-Palestine, but also conflicts in our lives. Yeah. I think the secret to understanding people is that whatever you say about you, the opposite is true to a certain degree.
Yeah.
I'm a massive introvert, but actually I don't mind doing this occasionally. It's a contradiction.
I'm a massive introvert too.
Are you?
Yeah.
The flowery shirt suggests otherwise.
Yeah, well, That's my defensive shield, Sam. I mean, what you say echoes, it's very interesting. What you say of the societies or nations. We had David Olusoga here 2-3 months ago. He was asked, I remember this very well, he was questioned just over here, and it was Churchill a hero or a villain? And David said, well, like every other human that's ever lived, he's both.
Absolutely. Churchill, he probably gave a better answer than I'm going to give, but Churchill saved liberal democracy. Right. Also, he was a massive racist, even by the standards of his time. His colleagues were frequently outraged by the things he said. Mm. Both things can be true at the same time.
You mentioned, but you're right, it's almost impossible these days to hold both of those things at the same time in your
Especially when the government are, when Boris Johnson in the middle of a global pandemic is saying, when he should be looking after human beings, is saying, I'm going to protect this statue of Winston Churchill with my last breath, as people are literally taking their last breaths because of his failures. Right. To him, a statue and this, it's also, he doesn't believe it himself. If you read his book on Winston Churchill, it acknowledges.
You've read that?
I have actually, unfortunately, read that book. But
there's a confession.
He's pretty frank about, his racist colonial attitudes. But then, when you're a politician, you're selling a more simple message. It's very depressing.
So how do we get, is this an educational thing? How do we get people to reach this subtle balance point in their judgment on bifurcated, divisive issues of which we are falling over ourselves with them at the moment?
Yeah, I would say it's education. It's true, the only answer is education and to read books. But the problem, I feel like we're drifting in the other direction in that social media increasingly sets the tone for everything. It sets the tone for our politics now. So politics is somehow getting even worse. So I don't know what the answer is. And a conflict like Israel-Palestine seems to have broken our politics and our social media. And I just wish people would read books more, but it doesn't seem like that's happening.
I wanted to, because one of the aspects of your book that I hadn't thought about at all, or perhaps just didn't know anything about, was the extent to which the impact of empire on the environment. And the social dimension is known to greater extent, but the environmental dimension actually was quite a revelation to me. Can you say a bit more about that, Sathnam?
Yeah, it blew my mind too, and because I don't really see plants as an extension of colonialism, because I see them as interior design, like most people. But actually, plants were at the cutting edge of the colonial mission. So cinchona gave us quinine, which enabled us to survive malaria, which enabled us to colonize large parts of Africa and Asia. Tea, we made tea, the British made tea into a national drink, not only in Britain, but in India, because they could make huge amounts of money of it. We went to war with China. The Opium Wars, one of the most misunderstood episodes in British colonialism. We lost the American colonies, Polly. Tea was involved in that. It created modern marketing. So the legacies are huge with tea. And then you've got rubber, which again, I didn't realize was a plant. And rubber became hugely profitable, so much so that we launched a war against Malaya, the so-called 1948 Malayan emergency, called the Malayan emergency and not a war for insurance reasons. Because if it was called a war, the companies involved wouldn't have got compensation.
Wow.
But also one of the darkest episodes, mass murder, torture, sexual abuse, very, very poorly understood in Britain. And actually, I've got one of the legacies in my pocket, because you told me to.
Bring a
They had it in my
prop.
bag.
Bring a prop.
Bring a prop. This is a plant legacy. Do you know what this is? Does anybody know what this is? I'd be amazed. It's a golf ball. It's a 19th century golf ball. What is it made of? Gutta percha, which there's a... I think someone
Who said that, by the way?
Someone over there.
Wow.
Gutta percha was the first plastic, really, and it was a natural plant. I think someone got a Royal Society medal. There's a sign downstairs.
Yeah, there is.
Called the innovation. And what this enabled the British to do is to cover wires with waterproof material and thereby lay the telegraph system, which enabled communication between London and the colonies. Mm-hmm. Even today, the wires that motor the internet follow the same routes. So this plant explains the map of the modern internet. But then we harvested this natural material to such a degree that it became almost extinct. Massive environmental destruction. But then, in reaction to that, British imperialists realized they were creating destruction and started coming up with environmental ideas and ways to conserve the environment, national parks, and so on.
Fantastic story. Round of applause for that story, actually.
I got it off eBay, £20. It's quite hard to get gutta percha, but some of you might have it in your teeth because it's still used as a filling material by some dentists.
Is it really? Mm. Can I ask you about people now exploring their mouths as you're saying that?
You get the bits of that white man's curry out of your teeth.
The Commonwealth Games. The final chapter of Empireworld talks about your experience at the Commonwealth Games in Birmingham. Obviously very moving for you. Actually reading it's quite moving. Can you say a bit more about that as an experience for you?
Yeah, I went to the Commonwealth Games not expecting much because the Commonwealth really has struggled to have a point since its beginning. I mean, what is it? You could say it's a collection of former British imperial states, but it's not, because actually I think Rwanda and Togo are recent members. They were never part of the British Empire. You could say it's countries where they all share the same monarch. That's not true. Yeah. Only a small number of the Commonwealth countries have King Charles as a monarch. Yep. I mean, when Nehru allowed India to become a member, he sold it to his cabinet on the grounds that it didn't mean anything, so we might as well join. I think someone described the Commonwealth Games as an off-Broadway Olympics. So I wasn't expecting much, but I found myself quite moved because the Commonwealth Games last time happened in Birmingham, and you had all these Commonwealth athletes coming to Birmingham, a hugely multicultural city. So multicultural, it gets beaten up regularly for being multicultural. All this talk about Birmingham being full of no-go areas because of Muslims and brown people, black people and so on. You know, it gets beaten up for its multiculturalism, but that night, it totally made sense to have a Commonwealth Games in one of the most multicultural countries in the country. And actually, it was quite a beautiful experience. I felt quite moved by it. Also, my book was part of the ceremonies, so that made me shed a tear or two. But I do think the Commonwealth could serve a positive function because you've got an organisation struggling for a meaning, chaired by a monarchy struggling to deal with colonial controversies, and you've got members who want to talk about colonial legacies. Why not put it all together and turn the Commonwealth into a kind of truth and reconciliation body for these issues? And I'm not the only person who suggested it. I think Demos suggested it about 20 years ago. It was laughed away by the Daily Mail, though. So the problem is, I actually think the royal family would be up for it because they are significantly more woke than our politicians. They have to be, because they have to listen to the Commonwealth. Yeah. And also they have to represent the multicultural nation. Yeah. The problem is we've got a government which are really keen on culture wars when it comes to the empire, so I can't see it happening anytime soon.
On that question of culture wars, I mean, I know that you yourself have, through the books, have been, well, subject to all manner of abuse, racist and otherwise, by dint of that. Can you say a bit about, not about that, but how you've coped with that? This is courage is a theme of the day, and you must have shown enormous courage in producing a second book, not least.
Yeah, I can't say I didn't throw myself into it with a sense of fun, given, I'd stopped doing adult events because people screaming at me, and, threats, having to report people to the police, stalking and all this kind of stuff. It made the whole process heavy. But I'm not the person who's suffered the most because, David Osogo, he probably didn't talk about it because he doesn't want to talk about it because it provokes people even more. But, he's known to have a bodyguard at certain events. Corinne Fowler, who was a historian who wrote the National Trust report on colonialism, regularly had to call the police, became too scared to walk down the street, is monstered and libeled in the press regularly, even now. So I think I've suffered less than them. But it's not acceptable. Historians are basically putting forward knowledge. You shouldn't be trolled and feel threatened because of that. And I feel like people aren't cross enough about it. Yeah. And often the people encouraging the trolling nowadays are the politicians or the newspapers who are also complaining about cancel culture. And it's like, what are you trying to do to us? You're basically trying to cancel us because we're trying to put forward a certain, new research or new knowledge. But and personally, sometimes it's horrible, but sometimes it's funny. It just depends on the day. Sometimes someone will send me a threatening letter and I'll post it on Twitter because it's amusing. Right. And it depends what else is going on in your life, and sometimes it's fine.
And I'm going to go to the audience in a second. Last question from me, though, Sathnam. Does that help explain? So one of the striking features of your follow-up book, Empireworld, is just how thick the bibliography is and the notes, right? You've been meticulous in backing up all of your stories with evidence and facts, so that this isn't the world according to you.
Well, that's because I get attacked a lot, and people say, you're not an historian, you're making stuff up. There's a sense that all imperialist ones are making stuff up. If it changes, because even Rishi Sunak has gone on the record, I think he said recently, people should stop trying to rewrite history. And it's like, that's literally what historians do. It's like, you've not understood. Even our understanding of the Romans is changing all the time because we discover things in archaeology. Our understanding of the Stone Age is changing all the time. Our understanding of the empire is changing really quickly, largely because the British repressed a lot of the information at the time. Right. There were so many documents being burnt when we left India that there was said to be a pall of smoke over Delhi, if you look into the origins of Nigeria, the men who founded Nigeria burnt all the documents because they knew history would not judge them well. The Mau Mau case, where we were forced into court, a lot of the documents have been concealed. Even now, the records of Lord Mountbatten, the final viceroy of India, are still officially secret. No one knows why. And yet he was involved in partition where up to 2 million people died. It's probably in the interests of the world to understand what he was thinking. And yet it's still officially secret. So I think there's been a concerted effort by the British state to conceal what happened. It's no surprise that 60 or 70 years later, a lot of this stuff is emerging. And it's no surprise that some people feel triggered because it challenges their version of events. Because what they were told and taught at school was wrong, at the very least.
Let's go to the room and collect some questions. And wait for the roving mic, but who'd like to ping the first question, Sathnam? Should we start over here and then over here?
Thank you very much. I'm really conscious that although we're having this conversation in the UK now more about empire, my mother's going to be 96, and when she grew up, when she was 11, the war broke out, and she had the map of the world at school, which showed 40% coloured pink, that was the British Empire. And my daughter, who's sitting next to me, when she was 6 at school, that was the same map, and it just says, we used to have an empire. Not great progress, but anyway, that's the anecdote. But the question is, I know nothing about what has Spain done about learning from its empire. What has Holland done about learning? I feel that I'm in a conversation here in the UK about what we need to do, but I feel very ignorant, and I wondered if you could help me.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and someone should write that book. But I absolutely do not think we are the country with the biggest problem with imperial nostalgia. The country with the biggest problem with imperial nostalgia is Russia. You know, it's nostalgia, it's inspired it to launch war. But that's what can happen if you have a distorted sense of your own greatness, right? There was a survey done of the former European colonial powers, and actually we weren't the most nostalgic nation. Can you guess which European nation was more nostalgic about their empire than us?
France.
No? No? The Dutch. The Dutch, and it makes sense. I mean, even smaller than us, they were way ahead of the British. I mean, the British were trying to catch up with the Dutch East India Company. Yep. So it would explain why they have these feelings. But equally, if you look at what they're doing, you know, I think the Dutch royal family have apologized. The parliament there has commissioned research. The Belgian parliament has commissioned a special committee to look into this. There's talk of apologies. The EU is talking about reparations. When it comes to doing stuff about it, we are way behind, I think, the international conversation. But obviously, nowhere near as bad as some. But I think we need to talk about it, in particular in this country, just because of the size of our empire, because it was the biggest ever. And also something about us being an island makes us disconnected from what we did. I think most other European nations have had a darker night of the soul when it comes to World War II. They've had to face up to their history, whereas we've never really had to do it because, oh, it happened over there, let's pretend it never happened.
Fantastic. Over here.
Hi Sathnam, my name's Lella. I just started my degree in politics and international relations, and one of the options I got to take for my modules was global history. And as someone who just completed my A-level in politics, which was focused on the Tudors and the French Revolution, this module really struck me as interesting and really left me wondering why in a space of an hour my lecturer was not only able to tell us everything that I knew about the French Revolution, but then teach us about things like the Haitian Revolution, which was arguably even more revolutionary and historically significant. So my question to you is, given it probably isn't in political interest to reform education, to share the whole truth and to talk about global history, what do you think we can do to make sure more young people are aware of our past?
That's a very good question. I feel that young people, in the absence of education, are doing it anyway. I sense a massive desire amongst young people to engage with history, mainly through the story of empire. And they're going to school and saying, Miss, sir, can you tell me about slavery? Can you tell me about the Raj? And empire is on the national curriculum, Key Stage 3, but it's a tiny proportion, as you know. it doesn't reflect the fact that British Empire is the biggest thing we ever did as a country. It doesn't reflect the fact that British Empire was the biggest thing, one of the biggest things that ever happened to the world. And it's especially absurd given, I think the world sees us through that prism, and we don't see ourselves. We see ourselves through the prism of, I don't know, what is it, World War II, Mr. Bean, you know, Oasis. But they don't, because they remember what happened when we last turned up. But I do sense, this is a good thing about social media, in that young children, well, students, young people in general, are learning stuff through the internet themselves, and then are reading books or listening to podcasts, and in the absence of an official education, are getting it through other means. I feel like I probably haven't answered your question, but thank you. Good luck with your degree.
And then we'll go to Ian.
Hiya, thank you so much for that. It was so interesting. My question is related to like what solid recommendations do you have for institutions? Because the thing I think is happening is for young people, for people from the global majority who are hyper aware of the legacy of empire, you feel like you need to just not engage with the older institutions who the minute you do a Wikipedia search, you're like, oh my goodness, what has happened? And I don't think that's necessarily the answer to progress, which is like creating a modern silo apart from the institutional silo. So what recommendations do you have to institutions on how they can, sorry, I have one of the millions of bugs traveling around London. What recommendations do you have to institutions like the RSA so that they can make plain in their actions that this is a welcoming space to young people and to, the many categories of people who would look into the history and see bright spots like awards for people who were campaigning for the abolition of slavery, but also the awards for the slavers?
It's a really good question. There's no simple answer to that, obviously. And you look at the institutions who have dark histories and what they're doing, and there's a huge number of responses. The Church of England, on Monday, is publishing its reparations report. It's dedicated £100 million to, as a form of reparations to descendants of people involved in enslavement. But more important than money is the engagement they're doing, the fact they're talking about it. And sometimes giving money can be culture washing, slavery washing, colonial washing, a way to shut down the conversation. I think if you're going to start giving money and start talking about reparations, you've got to be prepared for very, very difficult conversations and sit there and listen. And some institutions are doing it. I mean, just in my experience, Bristol University is doing it. They sit there and they listen. The Church of England are doing it. Individual families are doing it, like the Renton family, the Gladstones, the Trevelyan's. But also, I feel like as a country, whenever people mention reparations or this conversation, we clutch our pearls and go, oh my God, we can't pay. Was it 18 trillion pounds we owe reparations according to the UN? And people go, oh, that's impossible. It is impossible, but I also think we've begun as a country, we just haven't realised it. For example, I would say our relationship with Ireland has been completely transformed in recent decades through a process of post-colonial truth and reconciliation. I see the Good Friday Agreement as a process of reparations. There's been money paid out. There have been official apologies. You have same in Kenya. It's happened. We were forced there by a court. But we paid £20 million in reparations, and the Foreign Secretary issued an apology. And the King, when he went to Kenya, had a much more sane trip on one of these royal tours than he did when his son went to the Caribbean a few years ago. So I think we have the capacity, and we're doing it, but it's just very reluctantly. And there's also a huge disparate nature in how different organisations are approaching it. But I do think we have it within us. And again, I've not answered your question, but that's because it's a big question.
Question from my colleague Erin, who's stranded in Nottingham with the train strikes. Given that schools are largely filled with history teachers who mainly came from a white Eurocentric history curriculum, how do we educate history teachers to deliver more of a representational history?
That's a good question. I personally, in my experience, don't find that necessarily people's race affects the way they want to teach this. I definitely feel that lots of young history teachers want to teach this history because they care. I feel like it's a generational thing. I think young people in general feel the same way about museums as I felt going to Dudley Zoo as a 5-year-old. I remember going there and thinking, Mum, why is there a tiger on this windswept hillside in Dudley? Shouldn't he be in Africa? And I feel the same. Young people go to a museum, they don't want to go, or when they do go, they're looking for the loot. They want to talk about colonial history. But yeah, it is problematic that so many historians tend to be white. It's a very whitened kind of sphere, and it's very Western-centric. But I do feel like lots of work is being done to see history from other points of view. And most history teachers are also historians. Most of them have done history degrees. And I think they're affected by this radical change in the way, this change in perspectives when it comes to history.
Thank you. Here.
Hello, hi. Talking about museums. I was brought up in post-war England, and it was a very
Post-war?
grim time. Post-war UK,
Okay, right.
in London. Very grim time. But, you know, as kids we had a lot of freedom, and I was brought up in Kensington and sent off to look at the museums. And my favourite museum was the Imperial Institute, which was a Victorian building in what is now Imperial College. It was the best museum. I learned so much in that museum about the Commonwealth and commodities. Transmogrified into the Commonwealth Institute, and eventually moved to a lovely new building in Kensington High Street. And there was an awful lot of education going on there. I helped, even though I was a kid, I helped them with their children's quizzes, get them right for kids. There was a massive interest, but something happened. It kind of died. The whole museum, I think the Commonwealth Society decided not to carry on supporting it. And I think it was a missed opportunity, because that would have been a vehicle to actually encourage further education and learning about the empire. There was a lot in there about the empire, but obviously, probably you would agree that it was a bit sanitized at times. But I feel that that was a massive lost opportunity. And I agree with you, you know, museums actually can be fantastic. And, you know, we're not doing anything on that. We need more of that.
Yeah, I agree with one thing what you said, but I do think that in a weird way, empire was better taught 60, 70 years ago than it is today. You know, kids would be given the kind of things, the ingredients that were coming, and the resources that were coming from empire. They were talked about in a regular way, probably in a very one-sided way, but at least it was discussed. Now there's almost nothing. But I think a lot of that collection ended up at the V&A, which is probably the most imperial of all of our museums.
So, thank you. You've inspired me to buy both your Empire books whilst you've been talking.
Great.
What are you hopeful about, and what gives you cause for hope today?
You know what? I am actually really, really optimistic. It goes against my nature because I'm a very negative person. But I'm really optimistic because I never would have thought when I started writing Empireland that the V&A would give back the Ghanaian loot on a long-term loan. Even the British Museum is talking about giving stuff back. King Charles, you know, goes to Kenya and talks about what we did to the Mau Mau. You know, something's happened in the last 3 or 4 years. Even when Prince William and Kate had that disastrous visit to the Caribbean, where they stood on the back of Land Rovers and touched black children through a wire fence, you know. Even then, the right-wing monarchist press, even they were like, this is not right, you know. And something's in the air, something has changed, even in the time I've written these books. And I feel like it's unstoppable, because you can't stop knowledge. All of this is based on people learning stuff that they didn't know before. And you can embark on any number of culture wars you want. You can't stop people learning stuff. So I really do feel quite optimistic. I think this culture war that this government has been on is already over. I think the only person into it anymore is Jacob Rees-Mogg. Even he doesn't really care. You know, he's banging on about the National Trust on GB News. No one's listening. If you look at the surveys, most of the British public, 3/4 I think it's a good idea to teach kids about slavery and colonialism. 44% of the British public think the royal family should pay reparations for slavery, which is amazing because I don't think even people have even understood that the royal family were involved in slavery until last year. So I see fast and meaningful change happening, and I think it's going to be a very different picture in 10 years.
Fantastic, yeah.
Hi, my name's Laxman. I'm a trustee of South Asian Heritage Month. Sathnam, you said something's in the air, and I think quite literally in this room. And I wanted to tie into some of the questions that have been posed by others in the audience. Today, I've learned so much about just, again, nature and plants and empire. And there's so much more that has been discussed. And given that this is about courage on the wider perspective for the whole day, I'm just thinking, tying into questions that have come up earlier about what is the RSA doing about its history and its demographics and its fellows and what it should be doing more, is do you think, and also one for you, Andy, should the RSA start a new strand, literally about empire, and that affects around so many different topics, and start to lead the way and become more of an innovator rather than sort of skirting around it somewhat, because I would want this talk to grow into something much, much more.
Well, I'll let you deal with a difficult question. Yeah, thank you for the work you do in South Asian Heritage Month. It's a great innovation, that, and it's taught a lot of people about the history. Yeah, obviously this stuff needs to be talked about in a more meaningful way. I mean, I walked past some of the plaques there. There's something about breadfruit, and it tells you about how the Royal Society, I think, gave a medal to William Bligh. And it's interesting, but it doesn't explain the whole context. So the story of breadfruit is fascinating. Basically, I forget the name of the person who did it. I think it's Joseph Banks. That's right, thank you, historian in that side of the room. Right. Joseph Banks had this idea when he was on the way to Australia on Captain Cook's boat, that you could use breadfruit, he discovered it in Tahiti, to feed the enslaved. That it would be a cheap way of feeding all these people being exploited. So he made it his mission to transplant breadfruit from Tahiti to, places it could be used by the enslaved. But the interesting thing, what happened then, is that the enslaved didn't like it. And actually, they resisted it. So now, breadfruit is actually a very commonly eaten fruit, or food in Jamaica. But the evidence is that we have this idea that enslaved, just did whatever was done to them. But actually, there's quite a lot of evidence they resisted it. I think the breadfruit is an important symbol of that. I would like to see that story up here, or next to that bit where you say you gave him a medal. Stuff like that.
Yeah, we're going to explore that. I mean, as some of you will know, many of you will know, we have an in-house historian, Anton Howes. We have a 300-page book on the RSA.
Is that the person who just shouted out, corrected me?
And we've also asked Anton to look at our own history through this particular lens. Could we and should we do more? Almost certainly yes, is the answer to your question. And could fellows be part of us answering that question? I'm sure they absolutely could. So one for us to pick up.
Yeah, and I think the Royal Academy have really given you an example of what you can do. And it's not something that necessarily is going to cause you pain. It might cause you some pain, but it's not something that's going to be a miserable, joyless, unpopular thing to do. It could actually be really rewarding and interesting.
No, I agree. I mean, my previous gig at the Bank of England, they've just gone through something very similar, actually.
Yeah, because a lot of the trustees were heavily involved in slavery. Yeah.
And it's been hugely positive. So absolutely, that's true, not just of Royal Academy. Let's take some more questions. So this gentleman's had his hand up for quite a little while, so I'll definitely go to this side of the room, because I'm conscious I've missed out the...
Are flowery shirts, compulsory? With so many of them.
Read the memo.
I missed the memo.
Paisley design from India.
Paisley design from India.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Made in Turkey.
Oh, wow.
I'm Titus Alexander, and I wrote a book on unraveling global apartheid. And I wanted to ask you about the links and legacy and lessons of empire in global governance. Because if you look at the structure of global governance, it is an effective form of minority rule, except that rather than race as the discriminating factor, it's passports based on national identity, if you like. And if you look at the parallels between what happened in South Africa before the emergence of apartheid, or out of which apartheid was entrenched, it's quite similar to what's happening now, where you've got round the world barriers and walls being built up. You've got a strengthening of the resistance of, the majority world, if you like. So I wondered whether in your work you reflected on the legacy and lessons that we can draw from empire in terms of our current structures of global governance, which in many respects are actually more vicious than apartheid was in South Africa.
Yeah, it comes up a lot because arguably international law began with abolition. Arguably international labour law began with British indentured labour. The United Nations arguably was based partly on the League of Nations, which was inspired by the British Empire. So the legacies are absolutely everywhere. And then you've got the rule of colonial difference. You know, in the 19th century, when the Geneva Convention was being written up, you had this idea, which the British insisted on, that, you know, colonial people didn't feel pain in the same way, that you could use vicious bullets on them, dum-dum bullets on them because they were savages and they could be treated differently. Isn't that idea present everywhere in the world today? You know, you can brutalize people because they're not like us. You can see that in all sorts of disputes. So I can see the legacy of the British Empire all around the place when it comes to global governance.
I will take a question over here and then come back to the left wing.
I'm embarrassed to say I don't have a flowery shirt, or I haven't yet read your book, but I intend to this month. Given that pretty much every historical figure judged from our current viewpoint is potentially racist, certainly exploitative, all of the traits we associate with, the negative traits we associate with colonialism. How do you untangle that relativism, sort of not to judge from
using modern standards,
viewpoint, our current sensitivities, but judge them against the context of the time?
Absolutely, and well, I'll go back to what I said earlier. Opposite things can be true at the same time. Winston Churchill being an example. Gandhi, obviously a man who fought colonialism, heroic. We even have a statue of him near next to Winston Churchill, but had massively anti-black racist attitudes, you know, as a result of his experience in South Africa. So that idea that opposite things can be true at the same time can help us liberate that. But also you need to remember is that actually almost everything that happened in British Empire, every bad thing that every person did, was often opposed at the time by British people, by really important British people. Gladstone railed against the excesses of empire. Winston Churchill himself described Jallianwala Bagh as monstrous. Warren Hastings, one of the founders of the Raj, found himself dragged in front of Parliament, as did Lord Clive, to answer for his crimes. So everything at the time was being challenged. That's why we had abolition. That was a challenge to imperial policy. So often it's not applying modern morals to the past. Often you're just reminding people that it was objected to at the time.
Question over here.
Indeed, that was going to be my very question, which was, you know, the context of the time. So I'd just like to thank you again for a wonderful chat, and particularly for reminding us all, and we have to practice it all the time, of opposite things can be true both at the same time.
Tori, look at Rishi Sunak. Total bell end. But, okay, sometimes I think. But, you know, obviously, it's amazing we have a brown Prime Minister, but he actually stands in the way, I would say, of, you know, racial justice being achieved. So opposite things can be true at the same time. Yeah. Who knew that the Royal Academy audience was so liberal?
Thank you.
Maybe this is more of a personal question to you, but I was just curious, between your two books, how would you describe them in terms of different chapters in your life when you wrote Empireland or Empireworld? I haven't read the books, but now I want to, so I'm curious. It might provide some context.
I guess my first book, Empireland, was an act of incredible naivety. You know, I was near the bottom of my class in history. I'd not read many history books. I found them boring, dense, confusing. They didn't explain things. So it was a total act of naivety. I was teaching myself and teaching readers at the same time. The thing is, you can't do that twice. I think my editors of this book wanted me to do that, but I was like, I actually know some stuff now. So I can't pretend that I don't. And I'm just hoping that the audience come along with me. So the second book is more knowledgeable, but also, I guess, my understanding of the contradictions has become deeper, and also my feeling that this really is history that can unite us. And I also think it's totally key to us, carrying ourselves better in the world. And with Brexit, we're trying to redefine our relationships with the planet. We need to remember what we did the last time we went around the world. Otherwise, we look ridiculous. So it feels even more urgent than ever, partly because of Brexit. Thank you for your question. Thank you for all the questions. They've been very intelligent.
Well, listen, we should wrap things up. I've got this huge countdown clock.
Yeah, scary, isn't it?
To stop me overrunning, and now it's in the red. So we should draw things to a close. But listen, many of you have already said you're going to go out, rush out and buy Sathnam's books. And you're in luck, because they're on sale just outside. And if you're even luckier, Sathnam might even sign some of them for you, I think.
I will, yes.
So for those interested, that's the place to head. It just remains for me, though, it's been an absolutely fascinating discussion with lessons for us at the RSA to take away.
I look forward to your exhibition.
Well, it was that old. Could be an exhibition.
I can see the headlines of Telegraph. Royal Society of Art goes woke.
Yeah.
Picture of you on the front.
An exhibition's one way of doing it. Actually, when David Olusoga was here, I wasn't brave enough to ask him, but actually what I would love to happen is for him to do a film. He does these Our House Through Time things. Do RSA House through time, drawing on our archives.
That'd be fascinating.
Maybe you can invite him ask him on my behalf. But that, there's other ways of reaching into your history and telling the story, and we should think imaginatively about that. Listen, wonderful session, fantastic discussion, homework for us all to do, including buying and reading Sathnam's book. But for now, please join me in thanking Sathnam Sanghera.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks. Sounds great. Thank you.